You didn't burn a helpless old man's crop, Caleb Mercer said, his voice low and steady as the fire ate through 30 years of his life. You just called back everyone I spent my life trying to protect. The men in the black trucks laughed. They had no idea what they had done. They thought they had broken a 71-year-old farmer. They had no idea they had just woken up a legend. If this is your first time here, please subscribe to the channel and hit the notification bell so you never miss a story. Drop a comment below and tell me what city you're watching from. I want to see how far the story has traveled. Now let's go back to where it all began. Caleb Mercer had not slept past 4 a.m. in 38 years. It was not discipline anymore. It was memory. Rebecca used to say that farmers don't wake up early because they have to. They wake up early because the land calls them before the sun does. He still believed that. He still heard her voice in it. The night the wheat field burned, he was already awake. He smelled it before he saw it. Gasoline. Not the ordinary trace of diesel that clung to the irrigation equipment, not the faint smell of exhaust from the county road. This was deliberate, concentrated. The kind of smell that means someone planned something. He was out the back door in 14 seconds. The eastern field was already lit from one end to the other, orange and yellow tearing through rows he had planted with his own hands 7 months ago. Not just wheat, not just a crop. That field carried the last significant stock of a drought-resistant seed strain he and an old agricultural scientist named Dr. Harmon had developed quietly over the course of a decade. 12 neighboring farms depended on that seed to survive summers that were getting drier and harder every single year. Without it, they would be forced to buy from commercial distributors at prices most of them could not afford. Caleb did not call for help first. He ran toward the fire. He got within 40 yards before the heat pushed him back. He stood there with his hands at his sides, watching the rows collapse into each other, watching everything he and Rebecca had built dissolve into black smoke that rose straight up into the windless night sky. His jaw was tight. His breathing was controlled. He was not the kind of man who screamed at the sky. He never had been. Then he heard the engines. 3 of them. Heavy trucks, the kind with oversized tires and aftermarket exhaust. They were parked just beyond the fence line on the dirt access road that ran along the eastern edge of the property. He could see the headlights from where he stood, aimed directly at him through the smoke. He walked toward them, not because he was fearless, not because he did not understand the danger. He walked toward them because something inside him that had been dormant for a very long time recognized this moment and knew exactly what it required. When he got close enough, the driver of the first truck rolled his window down. Young man, late 20s, maybe 30, baseball cap pulled low. The kind of face that had never once considered the possibility that a consequence existed for anything he did. Smart enough to know what that smell means, the man said. Caleb said nothing. He looked at the man the way you look at something you have already assessed and already decided about. That's your warning, the driver said. Kane's people been patient with you, more patient than you deserve. You had your chance to walk away clean. He gestured back toward the burning field. Next time it's the barn. After that, the house. So here's the question, old man. How much do you want to lose before you start being reasonable? The men in the other trucks were watching. A few of them had stepped out, leaning against the fenders with their arms crossed, making sure the old farmer understood the size of what he was dealing with. Caleb reached down to the edge of the field and pulled one unburned stalk from the ground. He held it up and looked at it for a moment. Then he looked back at the driver. You didn't burn a helpless old man's crop, he said. You just called back everyone I spent my life trying to protect. The driver stared at him. Then he laughed. The others laughed too. All right, the driver said, rolling his window back up. Have it your way. The trucks pulled away without hurrying. No urgency, no fear. Just 3 sets of taillights disappearing down the access road into the dark, and Caleb standing alone at the edge of his burning field with a single unburned stalk in his hand. He stood there until the fire trucks came. Sheriff Laura Vasquez arrived with them. She was 44 years old, 15 years in county law enforcement, 6 of those as sheriff, and she had seen enough rural arson cases to know exactly what she was looking at the moment she stepped out of her cruiser and saw the fuel pattern. This was not a grass fire started by a tossed cigarette or a dry summer lightning strike. Someone had walked that field with a container, and they had been thorough about it. Caleb. She stopped beside him. You need to tell me exactly what you saw. He told her everything. The trucks, the driver, the words, the way they had not bothered to hide their faces. She wrote everything down. She asked careful questions. She did not tell him it was going to be fine, because Laura Vasquez was honest, and she knew it was not fine and might not be for a long time. I can open an investigation, she said. I can try to get traffic cameras from the county road. But unless someone saw those men at a fuel supplier, unless we find a container with a traceable batch number, unless one of them talks, I can't arrest Russell Kane for ordering this. I can suspect him. I already do. But suspicion isn't a warrant. I know, Caleb said. You know what Kane's going to say if you go public with this tonight? That I started it myself for the insurance money. That's exactly what he's going to say. Caleb looked out at the field. The firefighters were getting the last of it under control, but there was nothing left to save. Almost 70% of the wheat was gone. The seed stock that had survived was minimal, scattered in 2 small sections at the western edge that the fire had not reached. And even that was partially heat damaged. Go get some rest, Vasquez said, though she knew he wouldn't. I'll have someone out here in the morning. He did not go to bed. He sat on the porch until the sky started turning gray. And then he walked into the field with his work boots and began going through the ashes with his hands, checking every section, cataloging what was lost and what was not. He was still doing it when Mara Bennett arrived at 7 in the morning with food she had brought from her diner. Mara was 63, had run the same diner on Main Street for 22 years, and had known Caleb since before Rebecca died. She set the containers of food on the porch railing without saying anything and walked out into the field to where he was crouching in the ash. She looked at what was left. She looked at him. Caleb. Most of the Eastern Reserve is gone, he said without looking up. The seed I had tagged for Henderson's farm, for the Delgados, for the Cho operation up on Route 9. Gone. I know. I had a backup supply in the storage shed. The fire didn't reach it. But the humidity in there, I don't know yet if it's viable. He sat back on his heels and finally looked at her. I called 3 seed suppliers this morning. 2 didn't answer. 1 did, and told me they couldn't help me right now. Said their inventory was committed to other accounts. Mara went still. Committed since when? Since sometime in the last 48 hours. Apparently, she understood what that meant. Kane had not just burned the field. He had made calls. He had applied pressure in the places where a farmer who just lost most of his crop would go looking for help, and he had closed those doors before Caleb could reach them. Your credit line? She asked. Caleb gave her a flat look. Already, she said. Bank called this morning. Said there were irregularities that required review. Account frozen pending investigation. Mara sat down on the edge of an irrigation trench and pressed her hand against her forehead. She had known this was coming in a general sense. Everyone in the county knew that Russell Kane wanted this land and had no patience for being told no, but the speed of it, the coordination, the way it had all come together in a single night while the field was still burning, that was something different. That was not impatience. That was a plan that had been ready and waiting. What are you going to do? She asked. He did not answer right away. He stood up, brushed the ash from his knees, and looked across what was left of the field. His face was the same as it had been at the fence line the night before, controlled, measured, carrying something heavy, without showing where the weight was distributed. I need to make a phone call, he said. To who? He didn't answer. That night, after Mara went home and the last of the sheriff's deputies completed their scene documentation and drove away, Caleb went into his barn. Not the main section, not the equipment bay or the seed storage area. He went to the back, behind the old tractor that had not run in 3 years, to a door that was secured with a padlock he had not opened in a very long time. He stood in front of it for almost a minute. Then he took a key from the ring he carried in his left front pocket, not the same ring as his farm keys. A separate ring with only 2 keys on it, and he opened the padlock. The room inside was not large. It was clean despite having been untouched for years, because Caleb had always taken care of things even when he was not using them. Along one wall, under a canvas sheet, were photographs, folded maps, a road ledger, a worn, thick notebook with a cracked cover, letters tied with a cord, a knife in a leather sheath, tools, and hanging from a hook on the wall, also under its own separate piece of canvas, was the vest, black leather, heavily broken in. The patches were intact, the colors still bold despite their age. On the back, the main patch. On the chest, a name tab that said North Star. Below that, a position patch, Road Captain. He stood in front of it for a long time. Rebecca had known about all of it. She had known before she married him, had asked him everything about it in the way that only Rebecca ever asked anything directly, without flinching, genuinely wanting the truth rather than a comfortable version of it. He had told her everything, the years on the road, the decisions he had made, the things he had been part of, and the things he had refused to be part of. The moment understood that the road was teaching him something he could only apply if he eventually left it. She had listened to all of it and then said, "So you're not running from it. You just know what it was for now." He had never put it better than that. He sat down on a wooden stool and opened the road ledger. The handwriting was his, from 30 years ago, dense and angular. Names, dates, places, descriptions of situations and how they had resolved. It was not a list of debts. He had never thought of it that way. It was more like a record of proof that the things he believed were true, that people could be helped, that respect could be earned through consistency, that loyalty was not purchased or demanded, but grown through action over time. He found the number he was looking for near the back of the ledger. He sat with the phone in his hand for a while. Then he dialed. It rang twice. Who the hell calls a number like this at 11:30 at night? The voice was rough. The kind of rough that came not from performance, but from decades of genuinely not caring about softness. Caleb felt something he had not felt in a long time. The recognition of a voice so familiar it bypassed thought and landed somewhere older. "Grizzly," he said. Silence. Then North Star. The voice changed. Not softer exactly, but different. Like a frequency shift. "Is that really you?" It was not a question. "Yeah," Caleb said. "It's me." It's been Grizzly paused a long time. "Brother. 11 years since we talked. 14 since I rode. I know exactly how long it's been." Caleb looked through the barn doors at the dark field, at the black patches where the wheat had been, at the place where something he had spent nearly 4 decades building had been dismantled in a single night by men who had never built anything in their lives. Grizzly. Somebody came for Rebecca's land. The silence this time was different. Not hesitation, not surprise. Just the particular weight of a man who understood what he was being told and was measuring his response to make sure it was worthy of the moment. "Tell me," Grizzly said. So Caleb told him. He told him about Russell Kane and the freight terminal and the 18 months of rejected offers and the pressure campaigns and the other farmers and the water rights. He told him about the fire and the 3 trucks and the driver who had not bothered to hide his face. He told him about the frozen bank account and the seed suppliers who suddenly had no inventory, and the deputies who had documented everything but could not yet make an arrest. He told him all of it without emotion in his voice. The way he had always delivered information complete, accurate, and without decoration. When he finished, Grizzly said, "You call anyone else yet? Just you?" "Good. Give me until morning. I'm not asking you to—" "I know what you're not asking," Grizzly said. "That's why I'm offering." Then, after a pause, North Star. "You listening?" "Yeah. You won't face them alone." The call ended. Caleb sat in the barn with the phone in his lap and the road ledger open across his knees and the vest hanging on the wall behind him. And for the first time since he had smelled the gasoline and run out into the dark, he felt the particular steadiness that comes not from certainty about outcomes, but from the knowledge that you are not the only one who understands what is at stake. He did not sleep that night either. He spent it in the barn, going through the ledger page by page, reading entries he had not read in over a decade. Every name, every situation, every note about what a person needed and what had actually helped them and what had not. He was not reading it as nostalgia. He was reading it the way a commander reads intelligence before an operation, learning the terrain, understanding the assets, calculating what was possible. By the time the sky started to lighten, he had filled 3 pages of a legal pad with names, phone numbers where he still had them, and brief notes. Not a plan yet, a foundation. He put the ledger back in the box. He looked at the vest one more time. He did not take it off the hook. Not yet. He went inside, changed his shirt, drank 2 cups of coffee, and was back in the field when Mara arrived at 7:30. She took one look at his face and said, "You didn't sleep." "No, you made a call." "Yes." She waited. "Someone's coming," he said. "Who?" He considered how to answer that. There was no simple version that would mean anything without the long version. And the long version would take more time than they had right now. So he said, "People who owe me nothing and will come anyway." Mara studied him. She had known Caleb Mercer for 22 years. She had brought him food after Rebecca's funeral and sat with him on the porch while he said almost nothing for 3 hours. She had argued with him about the farm equipment insurance he kept letting lapse. She had watched him interact with 100 different people in 100 different situations and had developed what she considered a fairly accurate picture of who he was. But the way he said those words, "people who owe me nothing and will come anyway," the particular quietness of it, the absolute lack of doubt, told her she was looking at a version of Caleb Mercer she had never actually seen before. Not the farmer, not the widower. Something older than both of those things. "Caleb," she said carefully. "Who were you before you came here?" He looked at her. "Someone who understood," he said slowly, "that the only way to build something worth keeping is to make sure you never ask for anything back." He went back to working in the field before she could ask anything else. The morning moved. Mara went back to the diner, but kept her phone close and checked in twice. Sheriff Vasquez called to confirm the investigation was formally opened and to tell Caleb that the county road traffic cameras were being reviewed, but that the quality was, as she put it, not encouraging. One of Caleb's neighbors, a 60-year-old farmer named Doug Henderson, drove out and stood at the field edge for a while without saying much, and then asked whether there was any chance of salvaging enough seed for his spring planting. Caleb told him the truth he did not know yet. Henderson nodded, looked at the field, and said, "Whatever you need, Caleb, whatever I can do." Then he drove away. That was when Caleb understood something he had been circling without landing on. Cain had made a mistake that men like Cain always made. They calculated power in terms of resources and isolation. If you take away a man's money and his supplies and his crops, you take away his ability to resist. What they never accounted for was the kind of power that could not be purchased or frozen or burned. The kind that lived in the history between people who had been through things together. Doug Henderson had just driven out to a ruined field at 7 in the morning to tell a neighbor he was not alone. He had not done that because Caleb had money. He had done it because of 11 years of small decisions, lending equipment, sharing water access, staying up half the night with Henderson's wife when she was sick and the county road was iced over and the ambulance could not get through. None of it calculated. All of it real. Cain's money had bought him contractors and corrupt officials and seed suppliers who returned his calls. But it could not buy what Caleb had. The afternoon brought another piece of it. The bank called again, a different voice this time. A manager rather than a representative, walking through the review process in language carefully designed to say nothing specific. Caleb listened to all of it, thanked the man politely, and hung up. Then he called the 2 seed suppliers again, not to ask for inventory, but just to talk. One of them opened up a little nervous, apologetic, telling Caleb without quite saying it directly that he had received a call from a company he could not afford to alienate, and that he was sorry, and that when this was over, he hoped Caleb would understand. Caleb told him he already did. That evening, as the sun dropped behind the western ridge, Caleb took the key ring back out of his pocket. He walked into the barn. He went to the back room. He stood in front of the vest. he thought about Rebecca. Not the end. He never let himself live in the end. The beginning. The morning she had walked into the equipment supply store where he was buying irrigation fittings, completely out of place in her city clothes, holding a piece of paper with measurements she had copied incorrectly off a diagram she had found online. And he had stood next to her at the counter and quietly fixed her calculations before she could embarrass herself. And she had turned and looked at him and said, "Were you going to tell me? Or were you just going to let me figure it out?" He had said, "You were about to figure it out." She had said, "I'm Rebecca." He had said, "I know. I've seen you at the hardware store. I'm Caleb." And she had said, "I know who you are too." He took the vest off the hook. He held it for a moment, feeling the weight of it, the particular worn softness of the leather, the specific way the patches sat. Then he put it on. It still fit. He stood in the barn with Rebecca's photograph on the wall and the road ledger in the box at his feet and the key ring in his pocket, and he understood that this was not going backward. This was not nostalgia or desperation. This was the same thing. It had always been a man who knew what mattered, deciding to defend it with everything he had. His phone rang at 11:47 that night. Grizzly's voice was businesslike now, the warmth still there, but underneath the operational tone that Caleb recognized from decades ago. "We're coming in the morning," Grizzly said. "Don't do anything until we get there." "How many?" "Enough." "Grizzly, you said someone came for Rebecca's land." There was a pause. "We're coming, North Star. Get some rest if you can. Tomorrow's going to be a long day." Caleb set the phone down. He stood in the doorway of the barn and looked at the dark field, at the silence where his crop had been, at the narrow strip of salvageable wheat along the western edge, pale in the moonlight, small and stubborn and still standing. He reached into his shirt pocket and touched the unburned stalk he had carried since the night of the fire. He had dried it out. He was keeping it, not as a symbol, as a record, as proof that when they came for everything, they had not gotten everything, not even close. They came at 2 in the morning, the second night after the fire, and they were not quiet about it. Kane's men had learned nothing from the first visit except that an old farmer standing alone in a burning field was not going to drop to his knees and beg. So they had decided to escalate. 4 men this time instead of 3, 2 fuel cans each. They had been paid well and told the job was simple: burn the barn, make sure the seed storage went with it, and leave before the county road cameras picked up anything useful. What they had not been told was that Caleb Mercer had spent the entire previous day making phone calls. The first one to notice something wrong was the man in the lead truck. He had driven this access road twice now, and he knew the layout: the dark farm, the single porch light, the silence of a rural property at 2 in the morning where the only thing moving was the wind through whatever was left of the wheat. He knew what it was supposed to look like. This was not what it was supposed to look like. There was a figure on the porch, one figure, sitting in a chair, perfectly still. The porch light was on, and the figure was wearing something dark across his shoulders that caught the light differently than a jacket or a flannel shirt. The driver slowed the truck. "Why are you slowing down?" the man in the passenger seat said. "Something's different. It's an old man on his porch." "Drive." The driver did not drive. He sat with his foot on the brake and looked at the figure on the porch and felt something he would not have been able to name if asked, a particular quality of stillness that was not the stillness of someone sleeping in a chair or someone who had not yet noticed company arriving. It was the stillness of someone who had been waiting, someone who knew exactly how many trucks were on that axos and had already decided what the next hour was going to look like. Then the sound reached them. It started low, the kind of low that you feel in your chest before your ears fully register it. A single engine at first, then 2, then a frequency that multiplied fast enough that it stopped sounding like individual machines and became something else: a sustained, organized rumble coming from the direction of the county road, getting louder with a steadiness that made it clear this was not random traffic. "What is that?" the man in the passenger seat said. The driver did not answer. He was watching the road. The first headlight appeared at the top of the hill, then the second. Then the lights kept coming, Not the high beams of pickup trucks, but the paired lower lights of motorcycles. 2 by 2, cresting the hill in a formation so deliberate and composed that it looked less like an arrival and more like a statement. The driver counted. He stopped counting at 30 because the number had already exceeded anything he had been prepared for, and the line was still coming. Caleb stood up from the chair. He walked to the edge of the porch and stood with his arms at his sides. And the riders came down the access road and through the farm gate and spread across the yard in a formation that required no instruction. Because these were people who had done this before, who understood spacing and positioning not as tactics but as second nature, the muscle memory of decades on the road. At the head of the formation, one rider pulled forward and stopped his bike 10 feet from the porch. He was a large man, not tall exactly, but built in the way of someone who had spent a lifetime doing physical work and had never stopped. Gray beard, gray hair pulled back, face that had seen significant weather. He cut his engine. The riders behind him cut theirs in a rolling sequence that went from thunder to silence in about 4 seconds. Dean Hart Grizzly, to everyone who had known him longer than 6 months, swung off his bike and looked at Caleb. "You're wearing the vest," Grizzly said. "You came," Caleb said. Grizzly walked up to the porch steps and stopped. He looked at Caleb for a long moment in the particular way of men who have history together that required no words to access. "Brother," Grizzly said, "you look exactly the same." "I don't," Caleb said. "No," Grizzly agreed. "Neither do I." He turned and looked at the trucks still sitting at the far end of the access road. "Those your visitors?" "Looks like." Grizzly turned back to his riders and raised one hand. The instruction was clear, without a word being spoken: stay put, stay calm. Nobody moves unless I say so. Then he walked toward the trucks. Caleb came down off the porch and walked with him, 2 steps behind and to the right. Nobody else moved. The driver of the lead truck had made a calculation. This was obvious from the way he had let his truck roll forward slightly rather than reverse. The way a man does when he is trying to project confidence he does not fully feel. When Grizzly and Caleb got within 20 yards, the driver opened his door and stepped out, and 2 of the other men got out of the second truck. And for a moment, the access road had the particular held-breath quality of a situation that could still go in multiple directions. Grizzly stopped walking. "You came here to burn something," he said. His voice was conversational, not loud, not threatening, just a man stating an observable fact. "I'm going to ask you to set the fuel cans on the ground and get back in your vehicles." The driver crossed his arms. "This is private property business. You and your people need to leave." "The man behind me owns this property," Grizzly said. "We're his guests." "You're not." He paused. "Set the cans down." "There are 4 of us." Grizzly looked at him with an expression that was not contempt, not amusement, not anger. It was something harder to categorize, the look of a man for whom the arithmetic being offered is so far off from the actual numbers that he genuinely cannot decide if the other person is bluffing or has simply not looked behind him. "Count the bikes," Grizzly said. The driver looked past Grizzly's shoulder. His jaw tightened. He counted. He stopped counting. The second man, the one who had gotten out of the passenger side of the lead truck, leaned down and said something to the driver that nobody else could hear. The driver's arms uncrossed slowly. "This isn't over," the driver said. "No," Grizzly agreed. "It's not. But tonight it is. Put the cans down and drive away." 40 seconds of silence. Then the driver reached back into the truck cab, and for half a heartbeat, the tension in the yard became absolute, and then he pulled out a fuel can from the back seat and set it on the ground. The other men followed. 4 cans in a line on the dirt access road. They got back in their trucks. They turned around. They drove. Grizzly watched them go until the taillights disappeared. Then he turned back to Caleb. "They'll all be on the phone to Kane before they hit the county road," Caleb said. "I know." "Good. You want him to know you're here." "I want him to understand what he started," Grizzly said. "There's a difference." They walked back to the farmyard, and Caleb looked out at the riders standing beside their bikes in the dark. 63 people. Grizzly had told him on the phone: mechanics, welders, electricians, a retired veterinarian named Louis who had once fixed a broken chassis on the side of a Nevada highway and now ran a small animal clinic in Idaho, 2 nurses, a former Army logistics sergeant who had done 3 tours and now drove long haul, 4 men who farmed their own land in Montana and Wyoming, former members, current members, people who had been adjacent to the club for years. Every single one of them had gotten a call within 18 hours of Grizzly's conversation with Caleb, and every single one of them had said yes without asking what was in it for them. That was the thing about North Star. Nobody had forgotten. Mara arrived at 6:30 in the morning with her diner's coffee urns loaded into the back of her station wagon and 2 of her staff carrying boxes of food. She pulled into the farmyard, looked at the rows of motorcycles, looked at Caleb standing by the barn in his vest, looked at the large gray-bearded man beside him, and said, "All right, going to need to make more trips." She did not panic. She did not ask 100 questions. She started organizing food distribution with the same practical efficiency she applied to a Saturday morning breakfast rush and let the answers come to her gradually as she worked. Within an hour, she had pieced together enough of the picture to understand, in broad terms, what Caleb had been before the farm. She processed this information the way she processed most information, quietly, without drama, incorporating it into her existing understanding of him, rather than discarding everything she had previously known. "North Star," she said to him, when they were momentarily out of earshot of everyone else. He looked at her. "Is that what I call you now?" "Caleb," he said. "Same as always." "Okay." She handed him a cup of coffee. "Then you need to eat something, Caleb. You haven't eaten since yesterday morning." He took the coffee. "How do you know that?" "Because I know you. And I know you don't eat when you're thinking hard about something." She looked at him steadily. "You should have told me." "Told you what?" "Who you were. What you'd done. Not because it changes anything, it doesn't. But because you've been carrying it alone for a long time and you didn't have to." He held the coffee in both hands and looked at her. Mara Bennett had a particular quality of directness that he had always respected. She said things plainly and without agenda, and she expected you to receive them plainly in return. It was one of the reasons he trusted her more than almost anyone in the county. "I'll tell you the whole thing sometime," he said, "when this is over." "I'll hold you to that," she said, and went back to managing breakfast. Grizzly gathered everyone that morning and laid out what Caleb had asked of him the previous night. He had told Grizzly on the phone, no retaliation, no provocation, nothing that gives Cain a weapon to use against them. Protect the farm. Rebuild what can be rebuilt. Find the evidence that ties Cain to the fire. Give everything to law enforcement and let the legal process do what it exists to do. There had been some pushback when Grizzly relayed this, which was expected. A man named Torres, 20 years in the club, had ridden in from Arizona and was not inclined toward restraint. "We're going to let them burn this man's crop and just plant new seeds," he said. "That's the plan?" "That's the plan," Grizzly said, with respect Torres. Grizzly's voice had not changed in volume or tone. It did not need to. "Who called me?" "North Star." "And who decided the plan?" A pause. "North Star." "Right." Grizzly let that sit for a moment. "There's a reason one phone call brought 63 people across 3 state lines in under 24 hours. Think about what that reason is. Then think about whether you trust the man who earned it." Torres said nothing else. Caleb divided them into working teams that afternoon. A crew of mechanics and welders went to the irrigation system. 3 sections of piping had been damaged in the fire. 1 pump housing was cracked from heat exposure. And without functional irrigation, the remaining wheat and the replanting effort would both fail. The Army logistics man, whose name was Carter, took charge of inventory, cataloging exactly what seed stock remained, what was viable, what would need to be sourced elsewhere. 2 of the farmers from Montana looked at the burned field and talked to Caleb for an hour about soil conditioning and replanting timelines. The electrician found a fault in the barn's wiring that had nothing to do with the fire but would have caused a serious problem within the next 4 to 6 months. Everyone worked. Not because Caleb ordered it, but because these were people who understood that work was the answer to most situations that could not be solved with conversation alone. And Natalie Brooks showed up at noon with a press credential and a recording device and a particular expression that Caleb had learned over the years to associate with journalists who had already started pulling a thread and liked what they were finding at the other end of it. She was 31, sharp, in the way of people who had learned early that preparation was more powerful than aggression, and she had driven out from the county paper, not because her editor had assigned the arson story he had, but because 3 days ago, completely unrelated to Caleb Mercer, she had filed a records request about the timeline of Russell Kane's freight terminal project, and what had come back had not matched the public narrative at all. She found Caleb by the barn and introduced herself. "I know who you are," he said. "Laura Vasquez mentioned you might come. I want to ask you about the fire," she said. "But I also want to ask you about something else." "What else?" She opened a folder. Kane's company filed options on 6 properties adjacent to yours in the 14 months before the freight terminal project was announced publicly. That's not unusual by itself. Developers often acquire land quietly to prevent price inflation. But the terminal project was publicly described as a county partnership initiative. It was supposed to go through a planning process that included public input sessions. She looked up at him. The input sessions happened after Kane already had options on the land, which means the public process was staged. The decisions were already made. Caleb took the folder and looked at the documents she had printed. "You've shown this to anyone else?" he said. "Not yet. I wanted to understand the full picture first." "Who approved the options?" "County Planning Office. A man named Gerald Holt." Caleb looked at the name. He did not react visibly, but something behind his eyes shifted in the way of a person encountering a piece of information that connects to other pieces and suddenly makes a pattern visible. "Gerald Holt also issued the zoning citations on your property," Natalie said quietly. "The ones about structural hazards and contaminated runoff." Caleb set the folder down. "When were those filed?" "Yesterday afternoon." He looked at her. "I haven't received anything." "You will," she said. "Probably tomorrow morning. My source at the county office told me they went out in yesterday's batch." She paused. "Caleb, they're giving you 72 hours to correct violations that don't exist. And the timing the day after the arson, the day after 60 motorcycles showed up in your yard, that's not a coincidence." Caleb called Sheriff Vasquez immediately. He read her the list of citations Natalie had described and listened to 3 seconds of silence on the other end of the line that told him more than anything Vasquez could have said. "I'll make some calls," Vasquez said finally. "Laura." "Yeah." "Holt approved Kane's land options before the public hearings." Another silence. "Then, how do you know that?" "Someone with better research skills than both of us put it together." "Natalie Brooks," Vasquez said immediately. "Is she trustworthy?" "She's the reason we found out about the drainage contract scandal 2 years ago," Vasquez said. "Yes, she's trustworthy." Pause. "If she's right about Holt, then the citations are fabricated, which means Kane is attacking through official channels now instead of hired trucks. That's actually worse in some ways because it's harder to fight." "I know," Caleb said. "What do I do about the 72 hours?" "Respond to every citation in writing. Document everything. Get photos, measurements, whatever supports the fact that the violations don't exist. If they try to take this to an emergency hearing, you need a paper record that shows you responded in good faith." She paused again. "And Caleb, keep your people calm. If Kane can get footage of 60 bikers confronting a county inspector, he'll use it." "I know," Caleb said again. He found Grizzly 20 minutes later and told him what was coming. Grizzly listened without interrupting. When Caleb finished, Grizzly said, "He's trying to make us the story." "Yes. If we react, we become exactly what he's been telling people we are," Caleb said. "An outlaw club terrorizing a county official. That's his move. He burns the crop to provoke us. Then he sends county inspectors in knowing that 60 angry riders are on the property, hoping one of them does something stupid on camera." Grizzly was quiet for a moment. "Torres isn't going to like this." "Torres doesn't have to like it. He has to follow it. And if he won't?" Caleb met Grizzly's eyes. Then he goes home. Grizzly nodded slowly. All right. He straightened up. I'll talk to him. What happened that afternoon between Grizzly and Torres was not witnessed by anyone but the two of them. But Torres was back to work on the fence repair crew by 4 o'clock and did not say another word about restraint or its alternatives. Whatever Grizzly had said to him had landed the way it needed to. The zoning notification arrived the following morning, delivered by a county vehicle that sat at the farm gate for 4 minutes before someone signed Binos, apparently lost their nerve and slid the envelope through the gate without getting out of the car. Caleb retrieved it, read it, showed it to Natalie and Vasquez, and then spent 6 hours with Carter and the Montana farmers, producing a documented response to every listed violation: photographs, measurements, maintenance records, a written statement from the county's own water quality testing service showing clean runoff results from 18 months prior. He filed it with the county planning office before the business day ended. The office acknowledged receipt 20 minutes later, which was unusual. Normally it took 3 to 5 days. The speed told Caleb something. Someone in that building was watching this file very carefully, and whoever it was had not expected a same-day response backed by documentation that would require actual effort to refute. Natalie traced the fuel canisters the next day. This was the piece that nobody had expected to crack so fast. The arson investigators had recovered fragments of 2 containers from the edge of the burned field, not enough to identify the men who had carried them, but enough to read a partial batch number that connected to a distribution record. Natalie had a source at the state fire marshal's office who owed her a favor from the drainage scandal, and that favor produced a supplier name within 48 hours. The supplier was a commercial fuel distributor operating out of 3 locations in the state. One of those locations had sold a batch matching the partial number to a purchasing account registered to a shell company. The shell company's incorporation documents, filed 3 years ago, listed a registered agent who also appeared on the incorporation paperwork for 2 of Kane's subsidiary holdings. It was not conclusive. It was not the kind of evidence that would hold up alone in a courtroom, but it was a thread, and threads connected to other threads, and Natalie could give the shape of the larger structure even when she could only see pieces of it. She brought everything to Caleb and Vasquez together, sitting at Caleb's kitchen table with the documents spread out between them. If we can find the payment records that connect Kane directly to the purchasing account, Natalie said, and if we can find one person with direct knowledge of the order someone Kane spoke to, someone who was in the room when the decision was made, then we have an actual case. Vasquez looked at Caleb. Do you have any idea who was driving those trucks? Caleb thought about the driver's face in the firelight. Young, confident in the way of someone following instructions rather than making decisions. Not a freelancer, too organized, too coordinated with the others. Someone with an ongoing relationship with Kane's organization. Someone who understood what he was participating in. No, Caleb said. But someone does. That evening, Grizzly found him in the barn. Kane's on television, Grizzly said. They watched the evening news on Caleb's old television in the kitchen, standing side by side while Kane gave a statement to 2 reporters outside his corporate office in the city. He was polished and calm, and he used the word community 4 times in 90 seconds, which was approximately 3 more times than anyone who genuinely cared about a community would need to. He described the freight terminal as a transformative economic opportunity for rural Oregon. He expressed concern about the intimidation tactics being deployed against his company's good faith acquisition efforts. He mentioned, without naming Caleb or the club directly, that outside groups with questionable histories were interfering in what should be a straightforward business transaction. Intimidation tactics, Grizzly said. He's setting the frame, Caleb said. Before the story gets too big for him to control, he wants the county to think we're the aggressors. It won't work. It might. Caleb looked at the screen. If one of our people steps wrong, if Natalie's story gets delayed, if Vasquez hits a wall on the evidence. He paused. He's not stupid. He's desperate, but he's not stupid. And desperate people who aren't stupid are the most dangerous kind. He turned the television off. Grizzly, he said. Yeah, you told everyone why North Star became what he became, didn't you? Grizzly looked at him. Some of them didn't know the full story. And I told them. Grizzly sat down at the kitchen table. I told them about the Ridgeline situation, about what you did to stop that from becoming a bloodbath, about the riders you kept employed after the Sacramento trouble, about the family in Nevada you spent 4 months helping fight off a bank seizure with nothing but legal research and sheer stubbornness. He looked up. I told them the truth, Caleb, that you were the smartest man in every room you ever walked into, and you spent 30 years pretending not to be because you understood that the smartest thing you could do was let other people believe they were in charge until they needed to be corrected. Caleb was quiet. They didn't come because of the name, Grizzly said. They came because every single one of them has a specific memory of something you did for them or someone they loved, and none of it had anything to do with what you could get in return. Caleb looked at his hands. The ash from the field had worked its way into the creases of his knuckles 3 days ago and hasn't fully come out yet. I need one of them to talk, he said. One of Kane's people. The driver, or one of the men with him. Someone who was in a room with Kane and can testify to. How do you find that person? I don't, Caleb looked up. But the right kind of pressure will make them find us. He was right, though he would not know how right until the following morning, when a battered pickup truck with Arizona plates pulled up to the farm gate well before sunrise. And the man behind the wheel sat there for 4 full minutes before finally getting out with his hands held high and his face showing the particular expression of someone who has spent 3 days running from a decision and has finally run out of road. That man's name was Evan Pike. And what he was carrying in his jacket pocket was the piece that connected everything together, but what he was running from was something none of them had yet understood, something that would change the stakes of everything they had built in the last 4 days and prove that Caleb's instinct about desperate men who weren't stupid was more accurate than even he had wanted to believe. Evan Pike's hands would not stop shaking. He had noticed it on the drive somewhere around the 3-hour mark, somewhere in the dark stretch of highway between the last town with a gas station and the county line, when the reality of what he was doing had fully landed and his hands had started trembling on the steering wheel and had not stopped since. He was not a man who frightened easily. He had done things in the last 4 years that required a certain tolerance for risk, a certain ability to compartmentalize what you were doing and why and what it said about you. But what he had learned 2 days ago was different. What he had learned 2 days ago was not risk. It was something else. Kane was going to kill people, not metaphorically. Not in the way that ruthless businessmen killed opportunities or careers or livelihoods. Evan had seen the messages on a phone he should not have been looking at, in a room he should not have been in, during a conversation he was not supposed to overhear. He had stood very still behind a half-open door and listened to Russell Kane tell a man whose name he did not know that the situation had moved past the point where witnesses were an acceptable variable. Natalie Brooks was on that list. So was Sheriff Vasquez. So was Evan himself. He had not slept since that night. He got out of the truck with his hands raised because he had seen enough of the farm's new security arrangement to know that walking towards 60 people who did not know him with his hands in his pockets was not a choice he wanted to make. The gate was attended by 2 riders he did not recognize. Big men, quiet, the kind of quiet that came from confidence rather than uncertainty. I need to talk to Caleb Mercer, Evan said. The taller of the 2 men looked at him without expression. You got a name? Evan Pike. Neither man reacted visibly, but something shifted, a very small adjustment in posture. A brief glance exchanged. They knew the name. Of course they knew the name. Natalie and Vasquez had both mentioned it during the investigation discussions. The man connected to the purchasing account. The man whose face appeared on the periphery of Kane's operation without ever appearing in the center of it. Stay there, the taller man said. He walked away. The second man remained, watching Evan with the particular patience of someone who has no particular preference about how the next few minutes go. Evan stood at the gate with his hands still raised. which was unnecessary at this point but felt right given the circumstances, and waited. Caleb came out of the barn. He walked across the yard without hurrying, and Evan watched him come and tried to read his face, and found almost nothing to read, not hostility, not relief, not judgment, just a man taking the measure of a situation before deciding what it required. He stopped 6 feet from the gate. "Evan Pike," he said. "Yes, sir. You drove all night." "Yes, sir." Caleb looked at him for a moment, looked at the shaking hands, looked at the eyes that had not slept in 2 days. "Open the gate," Caleb said, not to Evan but to the man behind him. The gate opened. Evan walked through, and Caleb turned and walked back toward the barn, and Evan followed, because it was clear he was supposed to. They went inside, away from the riders in the yard and the people working on the irrigation, and the reporters who were starting to appear at the county road in increasing numbers. Caleb pulled 2 stools from against the wall and set them facing each other. They sat, talked, Caleb said. So Evan talked. He talked for 40 minutes, and Caleb did not interrupt him once. He told Caleb everything, how he had been recruited into Kane's operation 18 months ago through a contractor he had done work for, how the work had started small and gotten progressively larger in scope and darker in nature, how he had convinced himself at each step that the next thing would be the last thing and that he would walk away before it went too far. He described the night of the fire in detail, who else was there, who drove which truck, who carried the fuel cans, whose idea it was to speak to Caleb rather than simply set the fire and leave. He described the seed supplier calls and the bank contact and the county planning arrangement with Gerald Holt. He described the conversations he had personally witnessed between Kane and his attorneys and his private security firm. And then he described what he had heard through the half-open door. When he finished, the barn was very quiet. Caleb looked at him. "You have documentation." "In my jacket pocket." "How did you get it?" "Kane keeps physical payment records for the illegal stuff. He thinks digital is traceable." He's not wrong, but paper in a locked drawer isn't as safe as he thinks if someone knows where the key is. Evan reached slowly into his jacket and removed a folded envelope. Payment authorizations, dated, with his signature. Everything from the arson through the Holt arrangement through the other thing. Caleb took the envelope and opened it. He read through the documents, 1 page at a time without rushing, his face showing nothing. When he finished, he folded them carefully and set them on the workbench beside him. "Who else knows you came here?" he said. "Nobody." A pause. "Or Kane does. I don't know. I didn't tell anyone. But if he's had someone watching me, he has," Caleb said. "Not a guess. A certainty." Evan went still. "That's why I need you inside," Caleb said. He raised his voice slightly. "Grizzly." Grizzly appeared from the far end of the barn, which meant he had been there the entire time Evan was talking. Evan did not know whether to be alarmed by that or reassured by it. He settled on reassured, because the alternative was not useful. "Get Carter and have him check the road," Caleb said. "Both directions. And call Laura." Grizzly was already moving. Sheriff Vasquez arrived in 22 minutes, which was fast enough that she had clearly been close by and possibly expecting this. She came in with 2 deputies and a recorder and a legal pad, and she sat across from Evan at Caleb's kitchen table and asked him to go through everything again from the beginning, and Evan did. He was halfway through the second telling when the radio on one of the deputies' belts crackled. The deputy stepped outside, came back in 30 seconds. "Sheriff, we've got 2 vehicles on the county road, no plates, parked about a quarter mile east. Engine running." Vasquez looked at Caleb. Caleb looked at Grizzly, who had come back in from the yard. "How long?" Caleb asked. "Carter spotted them about 8 minutes ago," Grizzly said. "They were already there when Evan pulled in. They followed him." Evan's face had gone the color of old concrete. "I'm sorry," he said. "I thought I was careful." "You were careful enough to get here," Caleb said. "That's what matters." Vasquez stood up. "I need to make some calls." "Caleb, nobody goes near those vehicles. Nobody engages." She looked at Grizzly. "That means your people too. I need them on the property, not on the road." Grizzly looked at Caleb. Caleb nodded. "Done," Grizzly said. Vasquez stepped outside with her phone. The next 20 minutes were the tightest of the entire week. Caleb could feel it in the way the air in the barn changed. The younger riders were restless, moving without purpose, checking things that did not need checking. Torres had positioned himself near the gate in a way that was technically within the property boundary, but communicated very clearly that he was not fully committed to the restraint principle. Grizzly moved through the yard with a steady, unhurried presence, talking to people, redirecting energy, doing the invisible work of keeping 63 individuals from becoming a mob. Inside the barn, Caleb sat with Evan. "Why did you come?" Caleb asked. Not accusatory, genuinely asking. Evan looked at his hands. They had mostly stopped shaking, which was either because the adrenaline had leveled off or because he had moved past the point where fear was the primary emotion. "Because I did a thing I shouldn't have done, and I can't undo it," he said. "The field, the fire. I knew what I was helping with, and I told myself it was just property, and property could be replaced, and I kept telling myself that until I heard him talking about he stopped. Started again, until I heard him talking about people. Real people with names. And I realized there was no version of this I could live with if I stayed quiet." Caleb was quiet for a moment. "The night of the fire," he said. "That was you driving the lead truck." Evan did not deny it. "Yes, you're the one who spoke to me." "Yes," Caleb looked at him. "I remember your face." "I know, you were sure of yourself that night." "I was." Evan looked up. "I'm not anymore." Caleb stood up and walked to the barn door and stood looking out at the yard. The riders were settled. Mostly Grizzly's work was holding. The Montana farmers had not stopped what they were doing. Carter was on the north fence line with two others, doing a perimeter check. Mara had arrived with a second coffee run and was managing the distribution with the calm authority of a woman who had run a busy diner for 22 years and understood that feeding people was one of the most stabilizing things you could do for a group under stress. "What they did to the water pump," Evan said. "That wasn't Kane's order. That was Hendricks, one of the other contractors. He freelanced it. Kane's going to claim he didn't know about it." Caleb turned around. "Which pump?" "The main irrigation pump. East side." Evan paused. "They didn't just clog it. They replaced a specific valve with a defective one. It'll fail under pressure. If your poor people don't know what to look for," Caleb was already moving. He walked out of the barn and across the yard and called out for the mechanics crew. And within 3 minutes, he had 4 people on the east pump with Carter directing. The faulty valve was found in less than 10 minutes, deliberately installed, designed to fail exactly when full irrigation pressure was applied, which would have happened the following morning when the replanting crew started the watering cycle. The mechanic who found it held it up and said, "Another few hours and we'd have lost the new seed entirely." Caleb took the valve and carried it to Vasquez's deputy, who logged it as evidence. That was when Vasquez came back in from the county road. Her face was controlled, but Caleb had known her long enough to read the specific way her jaw sat when she was managing information that was worse than she had expected. "Talk to me," he said. "The 2 vehicles on the road," she said. "One of them just pulled away heading east. The other one is still there." She paused. I ran the partial plate my deputy got. The vehicle is registered to a security firm out of Portland that has done contract work for 3 of Kane's subsidiaries in the past 2 years. "Professional," Caleb said. "Yes." She looked at him directly. "Caleb, this is past intimidation. Professional contractors watching a property where a witness just arrived with documented evidence against their client that's not surveillance. That's positioning." "I know what it is," he said. "I've called for backup. I have 2 more units coming from the county line. But there's a window, maybe 30 minutes, maybe less, where we're in a situation that could go very wrong if anyone on this property makes a decision they shouldn't." Caleb turned and found Grizzly with his eyes across the yard. Grizzly was already watching him. Caleb gave a single small nod toward the gate. Grizzly understood and moved. He gathered the riders closest to the perimeter and spoke to them for 2 minutes. Caleb could not hear the words from where he stood, but he watched the faces and saw the shift, not happiness about the instruction, but acceptance. These were people who trusted Grizzly, and Grizzly trusted North Star, and that chain held even when the instruction was not what anyone wanted. Torres walked away from the gate and came to stand near the barn wall with his arms crossed, not happy, not moving, not doing anything that would become a problem. That was enough. The remaining vehicle on the county road sat for another 12 minutes. Then it moved not east like the first one, but west, circling around. Vasquez's deputy tracked it by radio. It stopped on the farm's north access road, which was unpaved and less visible from the main property. "They're repositioning," the deputy said into the radio. Vasquez said, "Hold. Don't approach." What happened next unfolded in the compressed, hyper-real way that moments of genuine danger tend to unfold, everything happening both too fast and too slowly, every detail registering with unusual clarity, the sequence of events feeling afterward both inevitable and impossible. The vehicle on the north access road pulled forward. Carter, who was still on the north fence line with his crew, saw it first. He got on his radio immediately. Vasquez redirected her nearest unit. Grizzly, who had stayed near the north side after repositioning the perimeter riders, moved to the fence line without being told. Two men got out of the vehicle. They were moving with purpose, not running, but the kind of fast, deliberate walking that people do when they have a specific objective and have decided not to waste time on subtlety. One of them had something in his right hand that caught the early morning light. Grizzly stepped to the fence. "Stop," he said, not loud. He did not need to be loud. The men stopped. They looked at Grizzly. They looked at the riders positioned behind him. They looked at Carter and his crew on the other side. The one with the object in his hand, a phone, it turned out not what it had appeared to be, and the light said, "We're here for Evan Pike." "He's not here," Grizzly said. "We know he's here. Then he's knows on private property, and you're not. Get back in your vehicle." The second man had his hand near his jacket. Not inside it, near it. The particular placement of someone who wants you to know the option exists. Grizzly looked at that hand. Then he looked at the man's face. Then he said very quietly, "Don't." The man's hand moved away from his jacket. It was not a decision made from reason. It was made from the specific instinct of someone who looks into another person's eyes and understands that the line they are considering crossing is one the other person has already crossed and already come back from. Caleb came through the gate. He walked to where Grizzly was standing and looked at the two men. He looked at the first one, the one with the phone, for a long time. Something changed in his expression. Not recognition exactly. More like the reconstruction of a memory, placing a face in a context older than the current one. "Marcus," he said. The man went absolutely still. "Marcus Driel," Caleb said. "You were driving a Harley Softail on Route 78 out of Elko, Nevada on a February night 11 years ago. Black ice. You went into the ditch at about 40 miles an hour. He paused. "I was the one who pulled you out of the wreck. I paid for your hospital stay because you didn't have insurance and the county facility wanted payment before treatment." Marcus Driel stared at him. "You told me your name when you were being loaded into the ambulance," Caleb said. "You said, 'I'm Marcus, and I don't know how to thank you.' And I said you don't need to. I said, 'Go live your life and do something with it.'" He looked at the man steadily. "What are you doing with it, Marcus?" The silence on the north fence line was absolute. Grizzly had not moved. The riders behind him had not moved. Carter's crew had not moved. Everyone on both sides of the fence was watching one man look at another man across the boundary of 11 years and a set of choices that had led them both here. Marcus Driel's hand, the one near his jacket, dropped to his side entirely. He turned to the second man. Something passed between them. A look, an argument conducted in a single second without words. The second man's jaw tightened. He looked at the riders. He looked at Caleb. He made a calculation. Then he took 3 steps back toward the vehicle. Marcus said, "I'm sorry." He was not talking to Grizzly. He was not talking to the riders. He was talking to Caleb. "I didn't know it was your place. I was just told there was a witness who needed to be." He stopped himself. "I'm sorry." He turned and walked back to the vehicle. The second man was already inside. They pulled away heading north, away from the county road, away from the farm, and they did not stop. Vasquez's backup units arrived 4 minutes later. The deputy swept the north access road and found nothing except tire tracks and a discarded coffee cup. One unit pursued the vehicle's probable route and located it abandoned on a Forest Service road 6 miles north, which told them everything they needed to know about how prepared Kane's people had been for exactly this outcome. Vasquez came to find Caleb on the north fence line where he was still standing. "You knew him," she said. "I knew him 11 years ago for about 4 hours," Caleb said. "In the way you know someone when the situation strips everything else away." Vasquez looked at the empty road. "He would have. Maybe," Caleb said. "I don't know what he would have done." "I don't think he knew either." "That bothers you." "He made choices that led him there," Caleb said. "That's on him." But the fact that someone like Marcus ends up working for someone like Kane because there's no other structure in his life willing to take him in, he stopped. "Yeah, that bothers me." They went back inside. The barn had become something close to a command center. Documents on the workbench, Natalie at one end with her laptop and her source contacts, Carter with his inventory sheets, Vasquez's deputy running a digital log of all evidence collected. Evan sat in the corner with a cup of coffee Mara had pressed into his hands, and the particular expression of someone who has done the hardest thing and is now discovering that the hardest thing is not the end of hard things. Caleb gathered everyone who mattered into one conversation. He laid it out directly. Evan's testimony and documentation gave them Kane's payments for the arson, the arrangement with Holt, the orders to destroy the barn, the hidden plan to contaminate the irrigations, supply and blame Caleb for the environmental damage, and the instructions regarding witnesses. Natalie's records connected the fuel purchase to Kane's shell company. Vasquez had the traffic camera footage showing the trucks near the property. The defective valve was physical evidence of continued sabotage after the initial arson. The incident on the north fence line had been partially captured on the body camera that Grizzly had been wearing, not the approach. Not enough for a full case, but enough to document that armed contractors had appeared on the property attempting to retrieve a cooperating witness. "What he doesn't know yet," Natalie said, "is how much we have." "He suspects," Caleb said. "Suspecting and knowing are different." Natalie looked around the table. "He's going to move, soon. And the way he moves will depend on what he thinks we can prove." "He'll go public," Vasquez said. "It's what he does when he loses control of a situation. He frames it before someone else can." She was right. They all knew she was right. "Then we need to be ready for him to do that," Caleb said. "We can't stop him from going in front of a camera. But we can make sure that when he does, the ground under him is already gone." Natalie had her story mostly written. She had been building it for 3 days. And what Evans' documents gave her was the spine it had been missing, the direct financial connection between Kane and the crime. She needed 2 more confirmations, 2 independent sources who could verify specific elements without relying solely on Evans' testimony. One of them was a farmer named Dale Cho, who Mara had been talking to for the past 24 hours. Cho had received the same pressure Caleb had: anonymous calls, suddenly unavailable seed suppliers, a visit from a man who described himself as a real estate consultant and made it very clear what would happen to the Cho family's water access if they continued to resist Kane's offer. Dale Cho had been afraid to talk. He had a family. He had 40 years of work tied up in land that was worth nothing without water rights. Mara called him while they were all still at the table. "Dale," she said when he picked up, "I know you're scared. I know exactly what they threatened. But I need you to understand something." She paused, and her voice had the particular quality it got when she was not performing honesty, but simply being it. Caleb Mercer spent the last 4 days protecting this county's water access for everyone, including you. He brought 60 people across 3 states to stand in front of the men who burned his field, and not one of them threw a single punch. The evidence against Kane is real, and it's documented, and it's going to come out. The only question is whether your voice is part of what makes it stick, or whether you find out later that you had a chance to stand up and didn't take it. A long silence. Then Dale Cho said, "What do I need to say?" Natalie's second confirmation came from Gerald Holt's assistant, a woman named Patricia, who had worked in the county planning office for 19 years and who had watched the zoning citations be drafted in real time with fabricated inspection records and had saved copies of the originals because she had been in county government long enough to know what a paper trail was worth when things eventually fell apart. Patricia sent the files to Natalie's secure email at 9:47 that night. Natalie read them, sat very still for about 10 seconds, and then said, "We have everything." Caleb looked at her across the table. "Kane's holding a press conference tomorrow morning," she said, "outside the courthouse. My editor confirmed he sent a media advisory 2 hours ago. He's going to get in front of this," Vasquez said. "He's going to try," Natalie said. She looked at Caleb. "We need to decide how to answer." Caleb looked around the room at Grizzly, who was leaning against the barn wall with his arms crossed and his expression that of a man who had already made his peace with whatever came next. At Evan, who had his hands wrapped around a cold cup of coffee and was watching Caleb with the particular attention of someone whose entire future was balanced on the decisions of the next 12 hours. At Mara, who was looking at him with the steady, level gaze of a woman who had asked him once who he was before the farm and was beginning to understand the answer. He thought about Russell Kane standing in front of a courthouse with cameras pointed at him, using every polished tool in his arsenal to turn 60 people who had rebuilt an irrigation system and replanted a field and protected a witness into the story of dangerous outsiders threatening a hardworking businessman. He thought about what Rebecca would have said. She would have said, "Don't fight his battle. Fight yours." "Tomorrow morning," Caleb said quietly, "we answer him where he can't control the frame. Not with anger. Not with 60 riders in formation, with farmers. With documented truth. With the people Kane thought were too afraid to stand up." Natalie was already reaching for her laptop. Grizzly looked at Caleb with something in his face that was not quite a smile, but was in the same territory. "You haven't changed," Grizzly said. "I've changed plenty," Caleb said. "I just haven't changed the part that matters." He went to find the legal pad with his notes and began working out exactly who needed to be standing beside him when the sun came up, because Russell Kane was about to discover that the most dangerous thing you can do to a man who has spent 30 years planting seeds in people is give him one night to call in the harvest. Caleb did not sleep that night either, but this time it was not grief keeping him awake. It was arithmetic. He sat at the kitchen table with his legal pad and worked through every name, every piece of evidence, every person who needed to be in a specific place at a specific time the following morning, and he did it the same way he had always done hard things methodically, without drama, with the understanding that emotion was useful for knowing what mattered and completely useless for figuring out how to protect it. Mara stayed. She did not ask permission. She made a fresh pot of coffee at midnight and another at 2 in the morning and sat across from him at the table and did not talk unless he talked first, which was the exact right thing to do, and he noticed it without saying so. At 2:30, he looked up from the legal pad. "You should go home and sleep," he said. "Probably," she agreed. She did not move. He looked at her for a moment. "I'm going to need you tomorrow." "Not here. In town. Tell me what you need." "Dalecho is going to be at the courthouse at 9. He's never spoken publicly about anything in his life, and he's terrified. I need someone he trusts to be with him when he gets there." "I know Dale. I know you do." "Who else?" "The Hendersons. 3 other farm families who received pressure from Kane's people in the last 8 months. Patricia from the planning office. And Evan." He paused. "Evan's the one I'm most worried about. He's going to have to stand in front of cameras and say things that will be used against him in his own legal proceedings. He understands that. He's agreed to it. But understanding something and doing it are different things. And he's going to need someone to look at when his nerve starts to go." Mara was quiet for a moment. "And you think I'm the right person for that?" "You're the right person for most things," he said. It came out simpler and more direct than he intended. He did not take it back. She looked at him across the table with an expression he could not fully categorize and then said, "All right, I'll be there." He went back to the legal pad. She refilled his coffee without being asked. At 4 in the morning, he walked out to the barn. Most of the riders were sleeping in shifts, some in the barn, some in trucks, some in tents that had appeared from saddlebags, with the particular efficiency of people who had spent years sleeping in places that were not beds. Grizzly was awake, sitting on a hay bale near the barn door with a cup of something hot and the road-worn patience of a man who had kept watch in harder places. "You should sleep," Caleb said. "You should talk," Grizzly said. Caleb sat down beside him. "Kane's going to have lawyers at that press conference," Caleb said. "They'll be feeding him lines in real time. Every word he says is going to be designed to create legal insulation. He's going to claim the arson is fabricated. He's going to claim Evan's testimony is coerced. He's going to claim that the presence of 60 motorcycle riders constitutes a pattern of intimidation against his business operations." He paused. "And some of that will land. Not in court, not eventually, but in the moment, in the way people hear it and form a first impression that is very hard to revise even when the facts come out." Grizzly looked at him. "So what are you going to do about it?" "I'm not going to fight his framing," Caleb said. "I'm going to make it irrelevant." "How?" "He's going to talk about outlaw bikers and fabricated conspiracies and a helpless businessman being extorted." Caleb looked down at his hands. "I'm going to show up with the people he actually hurt. Farmers who lost water access, families who received threats, a county official who watched the planning process be corrupted in real time and saved the documents. And I'm going to let them speak first." Grizzly was quiet for a moment. "And us, you park across the street, helmets off. Nobody speaks unless spoken to. You're not there to confront him. You're there so the county can see exactly who came when one of their own needed help." Grizzly turned that over. "That's harder than showing up ready to fight." "Yes," Caleb said. "That's why it works." He went back inside as the sky started to lighten and spent the last 2 hours before sunrise going over the documents one more time with Natalie, who had been awake the entire night and showed it only in the particular intensity of her focus. The way exhausted people sometimes achieve a clarity that rest can't provide. Her story was ready. She had coordinated with 2 television stations and a radio network, not a leak, not a preview, but an arrangement to release the full documented investigation simultaneously with Kane's press conference so that every reporter covering his statement would receive the countervailing evidence in real time. She had never done anything quite this coordinated before, and she told Caleb so. "Will it hold?" he asked. "My editor's been in this business for 30 years, she said. He called the documents airtight. He also said," she paused. "He said in his 30 years, he's never seen a story where the people being wronged were this organized." Caleb looked at her. "He means it as a compliment," she said. "I know," Caleb said. "I just want to make sure we deserve it." They arrived in town at 8:45. Caleb drove his farm truck, the same one he had been driving for 11 years, with the cracked right mirror and the county road dust permanently embedded in the wheel wells. Mara sat in the passenger seat. Natalie was in the back with her recorder and her files. Vasquez had gone ahead separately, in her official capacity, with Evan in protective custody in the rear of her cruiser. Behind Caleb's truck, 3 other farm vehicles, the Henderson's van, the Cho family's truck, 2 other families, whose names had appeared in Kane's pressure campaign. Behind them, from the county roadside, the riders, 61 of them. Grizzly at the front, moving at a pace that matched the farm trucks rather than pulling ahead. Disciplined. Intentional. They parked across the street from the courthouse, exactly as Caleb had described. The riders cut their engines in that same rolling sequence that had filled the farmyard 4 nights ago with organized silence. One by one, helmets came off. These were not young men performing a display. They were mechanics and veterans and farmers and fathers, standing quietly beside their bikes, watching without moving. Kane was already at the courthouse steps when they arrived. He had brought more than Caleb expected. 6 attorneys in 2 rows behind him. A professionally constructed podium. His own camera crew filming for his company's media channels. 3 printed boards displaying what appeared to be financial documents and architectural renderings of the freight terminal, the community investment version, the version that described itself as a jobs initiative for rural Oregon. He had also brought a crowd, not a large one, but enough. People whose businesses stood to benefit from the terminal, contractors, suppliers, 2 county council members who had accepted Kane's political contributions and were now committed to the position those contributions had purchased. Kane looked at the farm trucks. He looked at the riders across the street. He looked at Caleb standing beside his truck in jeans and a work shirt. No vest, no display, just a man who had come to hear what another man had to say. Something moved across Kane's face so briefly that most of the reporters missed it. Not fear exactly. The specific expression of a man whose plan had accounted for several contingencies, but not this particular configuration of them. He recovered in about 2 seconds. That was how good he was. He stepped to the podium. "Thank you all for coming," he said. And his voice had the practiced warmth of a man who had spent decades making rooms feel like he was on their side. "I want to speak to the people of this county directly today, because this county deserves honesty from the people who want to invest in its future." He was good. Caleb had known he would be good, and watching it confirmed the assessment. Kane built the narrative carefully, the freight terminal as economic salvation for a struggling rural community, the good faith acquisition process, the repeated attempts to reach a fair agreement with a single landowner whose refusal was holding the entire county back. He spoke with the measured confidence of a man reciting facts, not performing them. He made eye contact with the local reporters. He used the names of 2 council members as character witnesses. And then, with a pivot so smooth that it almost felt natural, he turned to the subject of Caleb and the riders. He described it as an organized intimidation campaign. He used the words threatening and coercive and extortion without quite saying any of them directly, choosing synonyms that carried the same meaning without the legal exposure. He presented photographs taken by his own people. Caleb noted, over the last 4 days of the riders on the property, at the gate, on the county road. He described Evan's arrival at the farm as a kidnapping, a witness being held by an outlaw group to prevent him from providing truthful testimony. The reporters were writing. The cameras were rolling. 2 of the council members were nodding in the background, which was the specific performance of men who had already been paid for their support and were fulfilling the terms. Kane concluded with a call for the county to recognize what was happening. He said the word community 7 times in 4 minutes. He mentioned jobs. He mentioned the future. Then he said, "I'm happy to take questions." The first question came from a reporter. Caleb did not recognize someone from a city outlet who had driven out that morning. She asked Kane to respond to reports that his company's land options had been filed before the public hearings on the terminal project. Kane's expression did not change. "Those reports are inaccurate. The timeline of our acquisitions was entirely consistent with county planning protocols." "Can you document that?" she asked. "My attorneys will make all relevant documentation available through proper legal channels." The second question came from a local radio reporter. He asked about the zoning citations issued to Caleb's property. "Those citations were issued by the county planning office based on a legitimate inspection," Kane said. "They have nothing to do with our acquisition efforts." The third question was from someone in the back who identified herself as a freelancer. She asked about a fuel distribution record connected to Kane's shell company. Kane paused for 1 second. "I'm not familiar with the specific record you're referring to. If you have documentation, I'd encourage you to submit it through." That was when Natalie's story dropped. Every phone in the crowd received the push notification simultaneously: the county paper's app, the television station's app, the radio network's breaking news alert. The sound of 24 phones buzzing in sequence had a particular quality to it, the sound of ground shifting under someone's feet. Reporters looked at their phones. Then they looked up at Kane. Then they looked across the street at Caleb. Kane saw it happening. He watched the room's attention divide and redirect, and he understood. In that moment, Caleb could see him understand it, that the frame he had spent 2 weeks constructing had just been placed inside a larger frame he had not built and could not control. He kept his composure. He was good enough to keep his composure. "I'll be happy to address any specific claims in that article through my legal team," he said. What's published online is not evidence, and I'd encourage everyone here to Mr. Kane, a different voice, not a reporter. Dale Cho stepped forward from the cluster of farm families standing to Caleb's left. He was 60 years old, had worked his land since he was 19, and had the particular bearing of a man who has spent his whole life doing hard physical work and looks exactly like it. He was not comfortable speaking publicly. His hands were in his jacket pockets, and his jaw was tight, and he was doing it anyway. "My name is Dale Cho," he said. "I farm 340 acres 12 miles east of here. Your people called my operation 4 times in 6 months. The last call told me that if I didn't support your terminal project, my water access would be reviewed for compliance issues." He stopped, steadied himself. "I've been scared to say that out loud for 8 months. I'm saying it now." Silence. Then Margaret Henderson, who was 67 and had driven out that morning with her husband, despite a hip that had been giving her trouble for 2 years, said, "Same thing happened to us, different words, same meaning." A third farmer said, "And us." Kane's attorneys were moving behind him, leaning in, speaking quietly, the specific body language of people who have just seen a situation change categories and are urgently recalculating. Kane put his hand up, a gesture designed to look like composed leadership rather than what it actually was, which was an attempt to stop more people from speaking. These are private citizens being used as props by an organized group with a vested interest in derailing Mr. Kane. Vasquez's voice. She had moved to the bottom of the courthouse steps, and she had her official posture on, not aggressive, not theatrical, just the specific stillness of someone with legal authority who has decided it is time to exercise it. "I'd like you to remain available. There are some questions we need answered." Kane looked at her. "In your professional capacity," his lead attorney said. "In my professional capacity," Vasquez confirmed. "Yes." Another attorney leaned into Kane's ear. Kane listened. He nodded once, the careful nod of a man who has been told by his lawyer to agree to something he does not want to agree to. "Of course," Kane said. "I have nothing to hide." He stepped back from the podium. That was when Caleb walked across the street. Not fast. Not with ceremony. Just a man walking from one side of a street to the other, in jeans and a work shirt, in boots that still had ash from his field embedded in the stitching. He came through the press cluster and stopped at the bottom of the courthouse steps and looked up at Kane. The cameras turned. Kane looked down at him with the expression of a man who has not yet decided what posture to take, whether to be magnanimous, contemptuous, dismissive, or conciliatory, running through options the way a machine runs through calculations. "You had something you wanted to say to me," Caleb said. "You've been saying it for 18 months through lawyers and land agents and men with fuel cans. I figured it was time we said it face to face." "Mr. Mercer," Kane's voice was smooth. "I've tried repeatedly to have a productive conversation. You froze my credit line the morning after you burned my field," Caleb said. Not loud, not angry, flat and factual, the tone of a man stating coordinates. "You called my seed suppliers before the ashes were cold. You filed false zoning citations through a county official you had been paying for 2 years. You sent contractors to prevent a witness from testifying." He paused. "That's not a productive conversation. That's a coordinated campaign, and the documents that prove it are in Sheriff Vasquez's hands right now." "Those are serious allegations. They're documented facts," Caleb said. "There's a difference." Kane's lead attorney stepped forward. "My client will not be responding to unverified allegations in a public setting. Nobody's asking him to respond," Vasquez said from behind Caleb. "I'm asking him to come inside." Kane looked at his attorneys. The calculation happening behind his face was visible to anyone who knew what to look for, weighing the optics of walking into the courthouse against the optics of refusing, measuring which was more damaging in a situation where both were bad. His investors were watching. His council members were watching. The cameras were watching. 60 motorcycle riders were watching from across the street without making a sound. He descended the steps. He passed within 4 feet of Caleb on the way down. He stopped. He looked at Caleb with the specific expression of a man who has lost the argument and needs to locate his pride in the rubble. Without those bikers, Kane said, his voice low and tight, you're nothing but an old farmer. Caleb looked at him. Being a farmer, he said, was never nothing. That was the first mistake you made. Kane held eye contact for another 2 seconds. Then he looked away first. And that mattered. And both men knew it. And the reporters close enough to hear the exchange would write about it in 4 different ways that all arrived at the same conclusion. Vasquez's deputies moved in on either side of Kane, and his lead attorney fell into step behind them, and they went up the courthouse steps and through the doors. 3 of Kane's attorneys remained outside, managing the press scrum, which became immediately and entirely unmanageable. The moment the first televisioner got confirmation from a county source that Kane was being formally questioned on criminal conspiracies and not as the attorneys were, carefully not saying, simply cooperating voluntarily. The investors broke first. 2 of them made calls before Kane was inside the building for 20 minutes. By noon, the freight terminal project had been officially suspended pending investigation. By 2 in the afternoon, County Council had issued a statement announcing a formal review of the terminal approval process. By 4, Gerald Holt had placed a personal call to Vasquez's office that her deputy described afterward as a man trying to determine how much swimming he has to do before he can find a boat. Caleb was back at the farm by mid-morning. He had not spoken to the cameras, had declined 3 interview requests with a politeness that left no room for negotiation, had guided Evan through the process with Vasquez's team, and made sure the man had both legal representation and a cup of coffee and a quiet place to sit between rounds of questioning. He had shaken Dale Cho's hand afterward and said, "That took courage." And Cho had said, "You did more than I did." And Caleb had said, "You did the part that mattered." He found Grizzly at the barn when he got back. Grizzly was watching the news on someone's phone footage from outside the courthouse, the image of Kane being walked inside, the shot of Caleb standing at the bottom of the steps in his work clothes with ash on his boots and nothing theatrical in his posture, and the riders visible in the background across the street with their helmets off. "That's the picture that's going to matter," Grizzly said. Caleb looked at it. 61 people who had been described as dangerous outsiders, standing quietly across the street from a courthouse, making no threats and no demands, simply present. Beside them, a 71-year-old farmer in a field-worn shirt, and behind him, the women and men whose livelihoods had been threatened and who had chosen to speak. "That's not my picture," Caleb said. "That's everyone's." He went to find Carter and check on the irrigation repairs. The mechanics had finished the pump work the previous afternoon. The defective valve had been replaced with a proper component, and Carter had personally pressure tested every section of the east line before certifying it operational. The replanting crew, a combination of riders, farmers, and 3 town residents who had shown up with shovels 2 days ago and had not been asked to stop, had seeded 2/3 of the burned area with the viable stock that remained. It was not the original harvest. It never would be. The rare strains in that Caleb had been developing with Dr. Harmon was partially intact, not fully, and rebuilding it to its pre-fire scope would take 3 to 5 growing seasons. But enough had survived, enough had been planted in time that the neighboring farms could be supplied. The Cho operation would have seed. The Hendersons would have seed. The 12 farms that depended on that specific drought-resistant strain would not lose the coming season. That was what the fire had been intended to destroy. It had not worked. Mara found him in the field an hour later. She had come back from town and changed out of her courthouse clothes into something more practical, and had apparently made a decision to not stand around the diner doing nothing when there was work to do. She stood next to him and looked at the planted section. "It's going to grow," she said. "If the weather holds," he said, "and if we stay on the irrigation schedule." "It's going to grow," she said again, with a certainty that was not meteorological. And he did not argue with it. They stood there for a moment in the particular quiet of people who have been through something difficult together and have arrived at the other side of it and are now allowing themselves carefully to believe that the other side is real. Natalie's piece is getting picked up nationally, Mara said. 3 networks called the paper in the last hour. I know. She's going to be very busy for a while. She earned it. Mara turned to look at him. What about you? What do you want out of this, now that it's turning? He thought about that honestly, the way he thought about most things, not quickly, but with the attention the question deserved. I want the seed cooperative finalized before the next planting season, he said. I want the water rights formally protected so that whoever farms this land after me can't be cut off from them. I want Evan to have a real legal advocate and not just the public defender the system will assign him. He paused. I want the county to look at what happened here and understand how it was possible so that the next developer who comes along with the same plan finds a county that's already closed the doors. He walked. Mara was quiet for a moment. You're already thinking about after. I've been thinking about after since the night of the fire, he said. The fire was Kane's move. The response was mine. But the thing that makes this mean something beyond the story, Natalie writes, that's what comes after. She looked at him. The particular way she looked at him had been changing over the last week, and he had noticed it and not addressed it because there were more immediate things to address and because he was not entirely sure what to do about the thing he had noticed. You said you'd tell me, she said, when this was over. The whole story. It's not over yet. No, she agreed. But it's turning, she paused. I can wait until it's all the way over. I've waited 22 years to ask. Another few weeks won't hurt. He looked at her. Something in him shifted, not dramatically, not with the kind of internal upheaval that made for good storytelling. Just a quiet adjustment, the way a long-held weight settles differently when you finally allow yourself to set it down somewhere safe. You've known me a long time, he said. 22 years. You've never asked. I figured you'd tell me when it mattered, she said. Turns out it matters now. He looked back at the field, at the planted rows, at the thin green line of surviving wheat along the western edge, the strip that had not burned, the section he had gone through with his bare hands the morning after the fire to assess what was left. Yeah, he said, it matters now. Inside the courthouse, Russell Kane sat in a room with 4 of his attorneys and 2 of Vasquez's detectives and a state investigator who had driven down from Portland that morning when the document package arrived and has the specific energy of someone who had been waiting for a case like this for a long time. Kane was still performing composure, still managing his posture and his word choices with the precision of a man who understood that everything he said was being recorded and would be used. But the performance was costing him. Caleb could not see it, was not in the room, had no way of knowing the specific details. But he knew how it worked. He had seen men like Kane before, not often, but enough. The composure held until the documents appeared one by one, and it became clear that the documentation was not fabricated, was not the product of coercion, was not going to be successfully argued away, and the attorneys started doing their own calculations about what was salvageable and what was not. Grizzly came to the field at 4 in the afternoon. He stood beside Caleb and looked at the planted rows and said nothing for about a minute, which was the kind of comfortable silence that only exists between people who have known each other long enough that the silence itself is a form of conversation. Some of the guys want to stay through the harvest, Grizzly said. They don't have to do that, I know. They want to. He paused. Carter's already talking to Henderson about the fence work on his north property. Louis says there's a livestock health thing on the Cho farm that he can address before it becomes a problem. The welders want to look at the barn roof on the Richards place. He glanced at Caleb. They're not just here for you. They came for you, and they found something worth staying for. Caleb looked at the riders visible across the yard, some working, some talking, some just sitting. 61 people who had arrived like a storm and were staying like a foundation. Tell them they're welcome, Caleb said. Tell them to stay as long as the work needs doing. Grizzly nodded. He turned to go back to the yard, then stopped. Caleb. Yeah. Rebecca would have liked all of this, Grizzly said. She would have found something to criticize about the execution, because that was her way, but she would have liked it. Caleb's jaw moved. He was quiet for a moment. She would have had opinions about the irrigation schedule, he said. Grizzly made a sound that was close to a laugh. She would have been right about it. Probably, Caleb said. Grizzly went back to the yard, and Caleb turned back to the field. And in the particular stillness of a late afternoon, on a farm, where the work was happening, and the crisis was turning, and the ground beneath everything was holding, he allowed himself something he had not allowed since the night he smelled gasoline, the specific exhale of a man who has not yet won, but has done enough of the right things to believe that winning is possible. It was not celebration. It was not relief. It was quieter than both of those. It was the feeling of a man standing in his wife's field, surrounded by the people he had protected, and the people who had come to protect him in return. Watching something grow from ground that someone had tried to make into nothing, understanding that nothing that had come for him this week had been able to take the thing that mattered most. Not the wheat, not the water rights, not the legal case building inside the courthouse. The thing that had grown in other people's lives over 30 years of quiet, uncalculating decency. The thing that Cain's money could not buy or burn or freeze or fabricate away. That thing was still here. And tomorrow, it would still be here. And that was enough for tonight. The county moved faster than anyone expected once the evidence was in front of people who could not afford to ignore it. Gerald Holt resigned from the county planning office on the fourth morning after Cain's arrest, which surprised no one except Holt himself, who had apparently believed until the final hour that his attorneys could construct a workable defense around the argument that he had simply followed standard procedures. What collapsed that argument was Patricia, his own assistant of 19 years, sitting across a table from a state investigator and walking through, document by document, the specific ways in which standard procedures had not been followed. She did it without anger and without theater. She did it the way a person does something they have needed to do for a long time and are finally doing, with the particular steadiness of long-delayed relief. Holt's resignation letter described a desire to spend more time with his family. Nobody quoted it seriously. Two of the county council members who had stood behind Cain at the press conference issued statements within 48 hours, carefully worded, legally reviewed statements that managed to express concern about the investigation's findings, without ever acknowledging that they had publicly endorsed the man at the center of it. Vasquez read both statements and said nothing about them to Caleb. But the look on her face when she mentioned them said enough. Cain himself was charged formally on the seventh day. The list was longer than even Natalie had projected. In her initial peace conspiracy to commit arson, arson in the first degree, witness intimidation, bribery of a public official, fraud in connection with a public planning process, attempted contamination of an agricultural water system, and 2 counts relating to the contracted surveillance and approach at the north fence line. His lead attorney entered a not guilty plea on all counts in a proceeding that lasted 11 minutes and generated more news coverage than any courthouse event in the county's recent memory. Caleb was not there for the arraignment. He was in his field. The replanted section had been in the ground for 8 days by then, and the first indicators were coming up thin, tentative, the earliest stage growth that required knowing what to look for to recognize it, but real. He crouched in the soil the way he had crouched in the ash 2 weeks before and ran his fingers along the surface with the same careful attention. And what he found was different this time. Not loss, not the accounting of what had been taken. Something new and fragile and alive. Carter came out from the barn and stood at the edge of the field. "You know, the irrigation on the east line held pressure all night," Carter said. "No issues." "Good. The pump's running cleaner than it probably was before they messed with it." Carter had the particular satisfaction of a man whose professional competence has been applied to a problem and has worked. Sometimes you pull the right thing apart, you put it back better. Caleb looked up at him. Sometimes. Carter went back inside. Caleb stayed in the field. He was still there when Natalie's car pulled into the yard. She looked different from the woman who had arrived with her press credential and her recording device 10 days ago, not physically, Not dramatically, but in the way of someone who has been through a significant experience and has not yet fully integrated it. She walked across the yard with her recorder in her hand out of habit, and then seemed to catch herself and put it in her pocket before she reached the field. "I'm not here for a story," she said. "I just wanted to tell you the national peace runs tomorrow." "I know. You sent the draft. You didn't respond." "I didn't have corrections." He stood up. "It was accurate." She looked at him. "Most people in your position want to shape the narrative, control the framing, make sure the version of events that goes out is the version that makes them look the way they want to look. I'm not interested in how I look," Caleb said. "I know. That's the thing that made the story work." She paused. "The national editors kept asking me what your angle was, what you wanted to get out of this. I kept telling them you wanted to protect the water rights and the seed stock and the neighboring farms, and they kept thinking I was leaving something out." "You weren't leaving something out." "No," she said. "I know. But it's unusual enough that people assume there's a hidden piece." She was quiet for a moment. "Caleb, I want to ask you something, and you can tell me it's not for publication, and I'll respect that. Ask, what does it feel like to be North Star again?" He looked at her steadily. "I'm not North Star," he said. "I never stopped being Caleb Mercer. North Star was the name for a function, a role the road needed for a specific period. This land needed a different kind of man. I became that man." He looked back at the field. "The vest was proof that I knew how to fight when it mattered. It wasn't who I was, it was what I'd learned." Natalie was quiet for a long moment. Then she said, "Can I quote that?" He almost smiled. "Yes." She drove away 20 minutes later, and Caleb went back to work. The writers began leaving in small groups over the following week, not all at once, not dramatically, the way they had arrived. Carter and his crew were among the last to go, finishing the fence work on the Cho property and the Richards barn roof and 3 smaller repair jobs that had accumulated as word spread through the county that there were skilled people on Caleb's farm who were willing to work and were not asking to be paid. A retired welder named Santos stayed 6 days past when he had originally intended because he found a structural problem in the Henderson's grain storage building that he could not in conscience leave unfixed. Grizzly was the last. He stayed until the morning of the 14th day, when the second irrigation test had held and the growth in the replanted section was visible from 20 feet away and no longer required expert eyes to confirm. He sat with Caleb at the kitchen table and drank coffee and did not say much, and then he stood up and picked up his jacket. "Come back for the harvest," Caleb said. "Wild horses," Grizzly said, which was not quite a yes and not remotely a no. He stopped at the kitchen door. "The Rebecca Mercer Seed Cooperative," he said. "That's a good name." "It was her land," Caleb said. "It'll always be her land." Grizzly nodded once. Then he went out, and a few minutes later, Caleb heard the bikes start, and the sound moved down the access road and out to the county road and faded into the ordinary sounds of a rural morning, and the farm was quiet in the particular way it had not been for 2 weeks. The cooperative formalized 6 weeks later. It was Mara's suggestion, originally not the name, which was Caleb's, but the structure. She had been researching agricultural cooperative models for 2 weeks without telling him, reading everything she could find about how similar arrangements had worked elsewhere, and she showed up one afternoon with a folder of notes and said, "You're going to do this right or not at all, and here's what doing it right looks like." He read through her research. It was thorough and practical and showed the specific intelligence of a person who had spent 22 years running a successful small business and understood exactly which details mattered and which ones were noise. "You should have been a lawyer," he said. "I should have been a lot of things," she said. "I ran a diner, it worked out." She sat down across from him. "The structure I'm suggesting gives 12 farms shared access to the seed stock and the irrigation water rights without any single party having the authority to sell either. You'd serve as the founding trustee. The other farms elect representatives to the board. No developer can purchase a controlling interest because no single party owns one." Caleb studied the document. "This closes the door Kane walked through. That's the point." She paused. "It also means that when you're gone not soon, Not for a long time. But eventually this doesn't go away. It doesn't get sold off. It doesn't get divided. It continues. He looked at her across the table. Rebecca wanted the land to mean something past her, he said. I know, Mara said. You told me. He looked back at the document. When did I tell you that? 4 years ago. You didn't think I was paying attention. She looked at him steadily. I was always paying attention. He signed the founding documents on a Tuesday afternoon in a county attorney's office with Dale Cho and Doug Henderson and 2 other farm representatives. And the attorney Natalie had referred to him, a woman named Cheng, who had driven out from Portland specifically for this case after reading the national EP and deciding she wanted to be part of it. The signing took 30 minutes. The conversation afterward took 2 hours and covered everything from irrigation maintenance schedules to the specific language of the Water Rights Protection Clause that Cheng had drafted to withstand legal challenge. When they walked out, Cho stopped on the sidewalk and shook Caleb's hand for a long time without saying anything. And what was in his face was the specific thing that does not have a clean name, not gratitude exactly, not relief exactly, but the combination of those things plus something older and harder to articulate, the feeling of having stood up when it was difficult and found that the ground held. My grandfather farmed that land, Cho finally said. My father farmed that land. My son's going to farm that land. I know, Caleb said, because of this. Cho gestured with his chin at the document in Caleb's hand, at the attorney's office, at whatever it represented. Because you didn't sell. Because you didn't either, Caleb said. Don't forget that part. Kane's trial began 4 months after the arrest. Evan Pike testified on the second day. He had spent the intervening months with a defense attorney that Caleb had quietly helped connect him with, not paid for. That would have been inappropriate, and Evan would not have accepted it, but identified and introduced. The attorney understood the situation's complexity and had negotiated a cooperation agreement that reflected the full scope of what Evan had provided. He sat in the witness stand and told the truth, every piece of it. He did not minimize his own role. He did not perform remorse in the theatrical way that sometimes appears in courtrooms from people who have been coached. He spoke the way he had spoken in Caleb's barn that early morning, plainly, completely, with the specific tone of someone who has decided that honesty is the only remaining option that he can live with. The defense cross-examination lasted 4 hours and produced nothing useful for Kane because the documentations supported every element of Evan's testimony and the documentation did not have a motivation that could be impeached. Caleb testified on the 5th day. He was on the stand for 2.5 hours. He answered every question with the same measured precision he brought to everything else. He did not perform outrage. He did not narrate his own suffering in language designed to provoke the jury's sympathy. He described what had happened, in sequence, accurately. And when the defense attorney suggested that the presence of 60 motorcycle riders on his property had itself constituted an intimidating environment designed to coerce cooperation, Caleb looked at the attorney and said, those riders came to protect the property while law enforcement built a case. They repaired the irrigation system, restored the fencing, and replanted a field that your client burned. If that constitutes intimidation, I'd like to know who was being intimidated and by what. The defense attorney moved on. Patricia from the planning office testified on the 7th day with her copies of the original unaltered documents and a 19-year memory for procedural detail that the defense was entirely unable to shake. She was the kind of witness that made the plaintiff's table relax, not because she was dramatic, but because she was boring in the exact right way, methodical and unimpeachable and completely indifferent to how she came across. Vasquez testified on the 9th day. She walked through the evidence chain with the systematic precision of someone who had built cases for 15 years and understood that a jury's confidence came not from passion, but from clarity. She connected every piece, the fuel batch record, the traffic camera footage, the payment authorizations, the defective valve, the body camera footage from the north fence line into a chain that had no exploitable gaps. Kane took the stand on the 11th day, which surprised almost everyone. His lead attorney had argued against it. The decision was Cain's own, and it reflected something about him that Caleb recognized from the courthouse steps the particular pride of a man who genuinely cannot believe the situation has arrived at a point where his performance is not enough to reverse it. He was good on the stand. He was composed and articulate, and he had an answer for everything. The problem was that his answers required the jury to disbelieve Patricia and Evan and Vasquez and Natalie's documented evidence and Dale Cho and the Hendersons and 4 other farmers and the fuel distributor and the county attorney's own forensic accountant. And that was too many people and too many documents to disbelieve simultaneously without a level of conspiratorial thinking that required abandoning ordinary logic. The jury deliberated for 9 hours. They came back with guilty verdicts on all primary counts. Cain stood for the reading without visible expression, which was either genuine composure or the end of genuine composure. It was impossible to know from the outside. And Caleb, sitting in the gallery, did not attempt to assess it. What mattered was the sound of the verdicts themselves. One after another, each one a piece of documentation that what had happened to his field and his neighbors and his county was real and recorded and would remain recorded. He left the courthouse before the press cluster could catch him. He drove directly to the farm. He walked into the field and stood in the section that had been replanted. The growth was substantial now, not harvest ready. Not yet, but far past fragile. The drought-resistant strain had taken hold in the new soil with the same stubborn vitality it always showed, the property that had made it worth developing in the first place. He stood in it and put his hand on a stalk and felt the particular aliveness of a plant that has done what it is supposed to do, that has grown from good seed in workable soil toward the light it requires. His phone buzzed. Grizzly. A text message, 3 words, "Told you so." Caleb looked at the message for a moment. Then he put the phone back in his pocket. Mara arrived an hour later. She had heard the verdicts on the radio in the diner and had closed 2 hours early and driven out without calling first. She found him in the field and walked in to stand beside him. And they were quiet for a while in the way they had become comfortable being quiet together over the last several months, a comfort that had developed the way most real things developed, gradually and without announcement. "It's over," she said. "The trial is over," he said. "The work isn't." "I know." She looked at the growing wheat. "I meant you can breathe now." He looked at her. "I've been breathing," he said. "Caleb." "Mara." She turned to face him directly. And there was the particular determination in her expression of a woman who has waited long enough and has decided that waiting longer serves no useful purpose. "You said you'd tell me the whole story when this was over," she said. "The who, where, you, before you came here story. The full version." "I know I said that. So tell me." He looked at her. He thought about all the reasons he had not told it before, not shame, not secrecy exactly, but the simple truth that the person you were on the road is not always translatable to the person standing in a field, and he had spent 30 years being the field version and had not been sure the road would make sense to someone who only knew the other one. But Mara had watched him call 60 people across 3 states with 1 phone call. She had watched him stand at a fence line and make armed men put down fuel cans. She had watched him look at a man whose face he had seen once 11 years ago in a ditch and call him by name and remind him of a kindness in a way that made that man turn around. She had watched all of it and had not revised her understanding of Caleb Mercer downward by a single degree. Maybe that meant the translation was not as complicated as he had believed. "All right," he said. "Let's go inside. I'll make coffee." "I'll make the coffee," she said. "You just talk." They walked back to the farmhouse. He talked for 2 hours. He told her everything: the road, the years, the decisions, the things he had prevented, and the things he had not been able to prevent. The moment he understood what the road had been teaching him, and the moment he saw the land and understood what it was asking of him. And Rebecca, the whole of Rebecca, from the hardware store to the end, the 38 years of building something, protecting, and the reason he had locked the barn door and not opened it again until the night the field burned. Mara listened the way she had always listened, completely, without interrupting, without softening the hard parts or rushing through them. She asked 2 questions. Both were the right questions. The kind that opened something rather than closed it. The kind that only a person paying real attention would know to ask. When he finished, the coffee was cold. She looked at him across the kitchen table. "You weren't running from it," she said. He looked at her. "You just knew what it was for," she said. Finally, he recognized those words. He had heard them before, 38 years ago, from a woman in a hardware store who had asked him a direct question and received a direct answer and decided that was enough to build a life on. Something in his chest did an old, specific thing that he had not felt in a very long time. "Yes," he said. "That's exactly right." She reached across the table and put her hand over his, and neither of them said anything else for a while, and that was the right thing too. Evan Pike reported to the county facility 4 weeks after sentencing for a reduced term negotiated in full recognition of his cooperation. His attorney had gotten it down to 14 months. He served 11, with good behavior, which Caleb could have predicted because Evan's problem had never been character. It had been the specific absence of a structure that called his character out. On the day he was released, Caleb drove to the county facility and waited in the parking lot. Evan came out and stopped when he saw the truck. He stood there for a moment with his bag over his shoulder and the particular expression of someone who does not know how to receive something they did not expect. "You didn't have to come," he said. "I know," Caleb said. Evan got in the truck. They drove back to the farm, and Caleb showed him the bunkhouse that Carter and 2 other riders had repaired during one of their return visits, and the list of seasonal work that needed doing, and the schedule for the cooperative's fall planting preparation. "I'm not doing this because what you did is forgotten," Caleb said. "I want to be clear about that." "I know," Evan said. "I'm doing it because accountability and redemption can be the same project," Caleb said, "if you want to do the work." Evan looked around the farm at the field, where the wheat was coming in strong now, at the cooperative's planting schedule pinned to the barn wall, at the irrigation system running clean and steady, at the place that had been targeted and burned and had grown back from its own ash. "I want to do the work," he said. His first paycheck, when it came, he spent on fencing materials for the Hendersons, whose north property line still had 2 sections that had never been properly repaired after Kane's campaign. He showed up there on a Saturday morning with the materials in the back of his truck and his own tools and did the work himself without announcement. Doug Henderson found him at it 3 hours in and stood watching for a minute and then went and got his own tools without saying a word, and they finished the job together by afternoon. Henderson mentioned it to Caleb afterward. Caleb said nothing, but the specific thing that moved across his face was the thing that moved across it when something happened exactly as it was supposed to. The harvest came in October. It was smaller than Caleb's best years by a significant margin, and larger than anyone who had stood in the ash of the burned field that first morning would have predicted. The drought-resistant strain performed exactly as it was designed to perform, efficiently, resiliently, producing from soil that had been damaged and healed and planted again with the particular stubbornness of a seed that had been developed to survive exactly the conditions this county kept generating. The cooperative's 12 farms received their allocation in the first week of harvest. Dale Cho came personally to pick up the Cho family's share and stayed 3 hours helping with the loading. The Hendersons sent their son, who was 26 and had grown up watching his parents' farm survive on Caleb's seed, and they shook Caleb's hand with the grip of someone who understands they are shaking hands with a specific continuity. Grizzly came back. He arrived 2 days before the main harvest weekend with 4 other riders and the Army logistics man Carter and the retired veterinarian Lewis, and they worked alongside the cooperative members and the town residents who had been showing up every weekend since midsummer without being asked. The riders and the farmers and the diner owner and the sheriff and the reporter who drove out from town to document it, and the young man who was working off a debt he could never fully repay, all moved through the field together in the particular way of people who have been through something real and have arrived at the other side of it, and understand that the other side is not an ending, it is just the point from which the next thing starts. Caleb stood at the edge of the field and watched. He had the dried stalk in his shirt pocket. He had carried it every day, since the night of the fire, not as a symbol he had decided upon, not as a deliberate gesture, but because he had put it there, and it had stayed there, and somewhere along the way it had become part of the weight he carried. The specific reminder that when they came for everything, they had not gotten everything. Mara came to stand beside him. "You should be out there," she said. "I'm out there," he said. "I'm just also here." She looked at him. The particular way she looked at him now was different from the way she had looked at him a year ago. And the difference was not complicated. It was simply the look of a person who knows someone fully and has chosen to stay anyway, which is the most meaningful thing one person can offer another. "The cooperative board wants to add 2 more farms next season," she said. "The Garza family and the Nakamura operation up on Route 12. I know. I talked to both of them last week, and, yes," he said. "If they want in, they're in." She nodded. "That's 14 farms. 15 by spring if the Weston Place decides." He paused. "The county's also looking at the water rights documentation as a model for the Northern District. Vasquez called me about it. The sheriff called you about water rights policy." "She calls me about a lot of things." Mara shook her head slowly. Not in exasperation, but in the particular way of a person who has stopped being surprised by a man who consistently operates at a different altitude than the observable evidence suggests. "Caleb," she said, "Mara, you should be proud of this." He looked at the field, at the grain coming in, at the 12 families whose operations were secured because the seed had survived and the water rights were protected, and the man who had tried to take all of it was sitting in a prison facility 4 counties away working through the early portion of a sentence that his own documentation had made unavoidable. At Evan Pike, moving through the rows with a harvest basket and the specific focus of someone applying themselves to honest work with genuine intention. At Grizzly, gray-bearded, road-worn, 64 years old, laughing at something Carter said, the full laugh of a man who is exactly where he wants to be. At the dried stalk in his shirt pocket. At everything that had grown from a seed no fire could reach. "The vest is in the barn," he said, hanging next to Rebecca's photograph. "That's where it belongs." "I know," Mara said. "The road brought them back to me. But this land is where I belong." He was quiet for a moment. "It was always where I belonged. I just had to prove I was worth belonging to it." She took his hand. Not dramatically, not as punctuation to a significant moment. Just the ordinary action of a woman who has decided that this man's hand is a good place for her hand to be and intends to keep making that decision. He held on. Out in the field, Grizzly looked over and saw them standing at the edge together and said something to Carter that made Carter look over too. And whatever Grizzly said, Carter's response was a wide grin, and Grizzly shook his head the way a man does when he has been proven right about something he has believed for a long time. The grain came in through the afternoon. The cooperative's records showed the strongest drought-resistant yield in 6 years. Natalie wrote a follow-up piece that ran in 4 regional papers and 2 national outlets about the Rebecca Mercer Seed Cooperative as a model for protecting agricultural communities from predatory development. She mentioned Caleb once, in the 4th paragraph, as the founding trustee. He had asked her to keep it brief. She had. The county converted a portion of the reclaimed freight terminal land fund, the project having been officially dissolved upon Kane's conviction, into an agricultural protection reserve that provided legal resources to farming families facing development pressure. The first application came from a family in the county's northern district who had been receiving the same kind of visits, the same kind of phone calls, the same kind of quiet, coordinated pressure that Caleb had documented so thoroughly that the county now had a name for it and a process for responding to it. The responding attorney was Cheng, who had stayed on after the trial and opened a small satellite office in the county because she had done the same calculation Natalie had done and arrived at the same conclusion. Something important was happening here, and she wanted to be part of what came next. The seed Caleb had pulled from the edge of the burning field That first night, the single stalk he had dried and carried, he planted it in the spring. It grew. Of course it grew. It was a drought-resistant strain developed over a decade by a man who understood that the purpose of resilience was not to survive intact, but to survive and produce, to take what had come for it and convert it into the next generation of growth. That was what it had always been designed to do. Caleb watched it come up in the corner of the eastern field, in the section that had burned worst, in the soil that had been ash and was now alive again, and he understood something he had been circling for a long time without landing on. He had not defeated Russell Kane because he was once feared on the road. He had defeated him because 38 years of quiet, uncalculated decency had built something that fear could not inventory, and money could not purchase, and fire could not reach. Every act of loyalty, every neighbor helped, every rider given a second chance and a direction, and the particular respect of being treated like someone whose life mattered. Every season of honest work on honest land for a woman who had believed in him completely. All of it had come back when he needed it. Not as an army, not as a weapon, as people, as the irreducible, undeniable weight of human beings who had been treated with dignity and had decided, without being asked, that it was worth something. That was the thing Cain had never understood. That was the thing men like Cain were constitutionally unable to understand. Because the calculation required for it was not the calculation of profit and leverage and acquisition and control. It was the calculation of a man who had long ago decided that the measure of a life was not what you accumulated, but what you grew in other people, and who had planted that belief in every season of the 38 years he had worked this land, and who had stood in a burning field one night and understood that everything he had ever planted was about to come home. He was right. It came home. Every seed of it, louder than any threat, stronger than any fear, and impossible entirely, permanently, absolutely impossible to burn.